Alright, so I'm Ed Liggett, a technical sports scientist with Catapult, and this webinar is aimed to be a beginner's guide to setting up and tracking your Catapult system to set yourself up for success down the road. Before you even actually have the monitors or have any data, what typically is helpful along the road is sitting down with your staff, with your coaches, and figuring out what major parameters or metrics would we find valuable right away. Now, not saying that this will immediately affect your decisions, but what are the major points that we want to look at on a day-to-day basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis? Whether you want them to be sports specific, for example, if you are an American football wide receiver, defensive back, you want to track your high intensity XL decel ratio, or if you are a soccer player, football player, total distance for the day, as that's a metric that a lot of coaches are very familiar with. The idea is to sit down and get a good bank of 5 to 8 metrics so you can track those solidly, wrap your mind around those as you progress, and go from there. What we like to call these are KPIs, or key performance indicators. Once you settle down on what you want these to be throughout the season, you can figure out what your session demands are, get a good idea of how you're loading your athletes or how you're preparing your athletes, and how you can alter that training in order to optimize both performance and, more importantly, to reduce the incidence of non-contact injury. One of the key statements that I always like to make when dealing with newer clients is to keep it simple. That's kind of the KISS method is kind of a universal method with any system, really, but keeping it simple will keep your conversations better, so you spend less time explaining specifically what the metrics are or the equations or algorithms behind them, and having more conversation on what this data means and how to react to it if need be. One of the simplest ways to break down our metrics is into two different categories: a volume measure and an intensity measure. Very similar to how a strength coach would run a weight room. You kind of track how much you do and how hard it actually is. And using the same concept, you can break down our Catapult metrics in order to give a good snapshot of what you're looking at for that specific need for the day, the specific session for the day, or the specific periods within that session itself, as well as tracking performance over time. Volume KPIs, typically the two that we go with are either distance, which is GNSS based, which is a combination of GPS, and GLONASS, which is the American and Russian satellite system. Fancy phrase for just saying more possible satellites tracking our system. And that's just simply, obviously everyone can wrap their head around distance. It's just how far the athlete moved. From the very beginning of the session, the beginning of the file, how far did that monitor travel on the athlete's back throughout that entire session? Regardless of speed, regardless of vertical displacement, how far did they go? And then the other variable that we often recommend is our validated player load, which is accelerometer based, completely independent of GPS or satellite. Represents all the work done, all the accelerations done within the 3 axes of that we have within our actual monitors, which we have our anterior, posterior, we have our lateral, and we have our vertical axes. In the analogy with distance is how far they traveled. With player load, it's how much they moved. Now, a lot of times this is a little bit more beneficial with less field-based sports, because there's a lot of movement going on in very confined space, or without even actually traveling distance at all. As far as you look at an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman in American football, they're doing a lot of efforts within a 2-3 yard gap. So for the play, they might have only traveled less than 5 yards. But at the end of the play, they're gassed, so you have to kind of accommodate and adapt your metrics to what your athletes are actually going to be doing and the style of play within the game itself that you will be tracking. The intensity KPIs are just kind of delving further into the story that the volume metrics play. A lot of times our newer clients like to look at either yards per minute, meters per minute if you're running with a metric system, or player load per minute, which all that's really doing is just taking those volume metrics and controlling for time. If you think about, say, an athlete ran 10K within an actual game, or 7 miles, that seems like a lot, but if your session's 4 hours long, then that's a very low intensity session. However, on the completely opposite side of the spectrum, if that 10K happens in an hour, the intensity obviously is much higher, and you have to adapt your training and recovery methods because of that. Same concept with player load, controlling player load for time and seeing how much work they do per minute will give you a good idea of how intense a practice is. And then another metric that we often look at immediately is either high speed efforts. So when we first do the install, we have our distance bands, our velocity bands. How many times did these athletes hit their higher speeds? So their sprint bands, their hard running bands. How many times did they reach that velocity, or how much distance did they cover while they're there? There's a lot of correlations between the amount of high intensity efforts, high speed efforts that an athlete does, and how much distance they're covering at those high speeds, relating to the larger intensity stimulus that the athlete's going through and receiving from that session alone. And again, all of these things are going to play into how do we need to address the athlete because of this, and how do we control for it in the future. Lastly, as an intensity KPI, we're going to get into IMA, which is our inertial movement analysis, which really is just looking into the very micro movements from the session itself. We can look at acceleration, deceleration, and change of directions left and right. What these are actually doing is using the accelerometers and gyroscopes to actually quantify and measure how hard these athletes are accelerating, decelerating, both forward, backward, and laterally. And then quantifying those even further down by intensity as well. We can usually go with 3 bands. We have a high, medium, and low band, and based off of these, you can get a good movement profile of what the athletes are doing for the day. You can manipulate the IMA in several ways. You can look at a volume-based metric where you can look at your total high-intensity movements for the day. So during the day, you can look at your volume parameter, which could be player load for the day, and you can look at your total IMA. So of that load, how much of that movement was done at a high intensity? How many of these micro movements actually occurred? You can look at total IMA, so total movements in general, and you can look at, for example, if you have an athlete who's very dominant left or right, or you're very concerned about lateral movements within the game, within the sport, you can look at your left versus right IMA. There's several different ways depending on what your sport needs and what your staff understands and would like to actually delve into a little bit further. There's several ways to manipulate IMA. And then with these, once you figure out what specific IMAs are important, you can go into and understand what a movement profile is for the day. So what do our forwards look like? What do our guards look like? What do our wide receivers on the left side of the field look like? Right side of the field? What is the game demands on a very, very specific sense? What are we going through on a day-to-day basis? And then once you have what you're actually going to be tracking, what's important to your actual day-to-day understanding of what the athletes are going through, the stimulus, the stresses, the responses that they're going to be going through, you can kind of understand, you dive into how you're going to track. So we know what we're going to do, now how are we going to do it? There's 2 general approaches to taking tracking. There's longitudinal or cross-sectional. This portion of the webinar is only really going to address programs without the full squad or full team outfitted with monitors. So for example, someone who has a 20-man roster, they only have 12 monitors. How are we going to approach that lack of being able to track everyone all the time? How do we modify what we're doing, and how do we actually use those monitors to get the biggest benefit? There's 2 different lines of thought here. There's a longitudinal tracking, which is picking the same people every day, day in, day out, and getting their sessions, their stimulus, their movements, their metrics every day. And then there's a cross-sectional approach. So for one game, you could actually just take 12 monitors and put them on the defensive players, and the next game you take 12 monitors, so those same 12 monitors, and put them on the offensive players, so you can get overall, after a while, build the largest average set to understand what the full game demands are. There's pros and cons of both longitudinal analysis as well as cross-sectional. We're going to dive in right now to what those actually are. Longitudinal analysis is very beneficial if you have key players that you need to keep a very close eye on. So starters, your all-stars on your team, or your red flags or developmental prospects. So there's several different lines of thought. Do you want to keep your best guys healthy? Do you want to keep a very close eye on those returning from injury? Or do you want to have the most data for your potential all-stars future in their future? The big pros of longitudinal analysis is you get a true spectrum you get a big picture of what's going on with this athlete, so you can track them over time. So you know day to day what's going on. We know what week 1 looks like compared to week 2, compared to week 3. We know what the postseason looks like to preseason. You can get a very good average on each of the individual players as well as the progression of the season on these actual athletes. Cross-sectional approach is a little bit different. What it really does, if you're not tracking consistently, is it just gives you a snapshot for the day. So you can, after your session, just sit down, look at the data. All right, what did they do specifically today? With this approach, you can get a more diverse idea of the game, of the stimulus of the practice of the games throughout time. However, you can't see the long-term effects as far as what chronic load looks like. You can't really look at what fatigue looks like or overuse looks like because you don't know what those gaps in your data will be. And to summarize, the biggest con of all of them is really just there's no trend finding within this actual approach. And a lot of times, too, there's so many different sessions going into the day as far as developing athletic ability and skill and preparing for games and competition. A lot of questions are asked about what specifically we should look at. Conditioning, should we look at movement sessions? Should we look at our weight room sessions? Should we look at our practice? And starting off, it's important to track as much as logistically possible in order to reap the biggest benefit. It's better to have data and just toss it aside or just not look at it than to sit back and wish, well, I wish I knew what our stride looks like on our conditioning session. It's better to have the data and ignore it, and then as opposed to need it and then just realize you forgot to track it or didn't track it. And then with this approach is getting as much as possible, it gives you a more complete view of what's going on. So if you have an athlete coming in for extra work and they're not monitoring that, they might have a light practice, but they're gassed, they're fatigued 2-3 days down the road. It might be a light week with the whole team setting, but if they're off to the side doing extra work on their own and you're not tracking that, there's a lot of load going on. There's a lot of stimulus going on that we're not accounting for. What we're doing in the long run is just leaving out the guesswork. So this just kind of gives us the idea of what exactly do they experience. Now, one thing to keep in mind throughout this entire decision-making process as you set up your Catapult system is keep in mind the end goal. And the end goal of all this data analytics is to have actionable data analysis. So what that means is from what we're looking at, can we make a decision to affect a change as far as injury or as far as performance goes? The biggest limiting problem, especially with newer users, is inconclusive data sets because the data set itself is limited. And what I mean by this is that the smaller the data set, the smaller the decisions you can really make off of that data. And conversely, the more data you have, the bigger the decisions that you can make. It's hard to jump to conclusions and have a substantial outcome based off of 1 or 2 days of data when you have a full season, 1 to 2 years in comparison. A lot of times I get the question is, what's enough data in order to start making decisions? And there's some recommendations depending on who you're talking to and as far as how much your program is willing to be patient on this. I've heard from 1 in season to 1 to 2 full years, both in and out of season, to just 8 games in season. Tracking longitudinally is enough to give you data. It all just depends on your specific situation with your data as well as what your coaching staff is comfortable waiting on. And the last thing that will probably help you out a lot in the long run is really the bookkeeping, the boring nuts and bolts of what's going to go into your database and what's going to help you in the long run. It's important to use it's important to keep everything consistent, so you name all of the periods, all the drills that are the same drill itself, to label them the exact same way. So when you're trying to recall and compare drills over a specific amount of time, it's easier to actually pull up that data. It allows for easier reference, and it allows for your database to look cleaner as well as operate more functionally. And then a little subset within this actual labeling is your activity tagging. So what you can do within OpenField is actually tag your activity. So you have your activity name, but you can also throw this activity into a larger category. So this activity tag could be a practice, a walkthrough. This could be a Monday practice. So later on, you can actually set up filters within your charts to have all your sessions selected, and you can have your activity tags equals Monday. So what this will do is it'll actually generate just this chart for whatever practices you have labeled Monday, or for whatever activity tag you have selected. So if you want to just look at your practices, you can just look at your practices. If you want to exclude games, you can exclude games. It's all just depends on how you want to set up your activity tagging and how you want to set up your database. You can apply this same idea to your actual periods, so to your drills. You can categorize them as rehab. You can categorize them as injuries, so you can categorize what's going on in each of these periods, so you can have a better idea in the long run later on when you need to look at what's going on in the session. And you can do the same thing as far as athlete tagging individually within the session itself. You can tag an athlete as injured or rehab or off to the side, so that you can actually exclude that information from your database and from your average set, so you don't have those outliers throwing off your general data. It's all important to keep this in mind as you go, as you build out your database, because down the line it's going to be much more taxing, much more time consuming to go back in and retroactively apply your tags in your databases. It can be done, but it's just a matter of time and frustration as far as that is concerned. And that reaches the end of this webinar. I hope this has been helpful for all of our new users and gets you some ideas so you can hit the ground running with your Catapult system.